When the police report dropped in December 2020, it felt like a sick joke. Jung Il-hoon, the main rapper of BTOB, a group that had literally built their entire empire on being an emotional safe haven, was arrested for buying and using marijuana and psychotropic drugs. For almost 8 years, going all the way back to 2016, he had been using. We're talking about millions of won spent on disguising illegal drugs as slimming pills, sneaking around, living a double life right under the noses of his members, his company, and the fans who treated his group like therapy. The irony was so heavy it was hard to breathe. This was a guy who wrote joyful, playful lyrics, who smiled on variety shows, who stood on stage while his group mates sang about how it's okay to not be okay. And the whole time, he was hiding a massive, illegal secret. The fallout was instantaneous and brutal. Fans couldn't believe it. Netizens tore into the hypocrisy of a group famous for their pristine ball, ads and emotional sincerity harboring a felon. In K-pop, you expect scandals from the wild groups, the bad boys, the ones leaning into controversy. But BTOB, the vocal monsters who just stood still and sang, it broke a very specific kind of unspoken contract with the public. To understand why this specific scandal hit so different, you have to look at the suffocating burden BTOB carried long before Il-hoon ever got caught. When they debuted in 2012, nobody handed them instant success. They had to claw for attention in an industry that was moving at light speed around them. When their breakout hit It's Okay dropped in 2015, it wasn't just a catchy song. It became a lifeline for a generation of exhausted young people. The problem with becoming a lifeline, though, is that people start expecting you to save them. BTOB stopped being just an idol group and morphed into this weird, quasi-spiritual support system. Every ballad they released was treated like gospel. Every lyric was analyzed for emotional salvation. The fans, Melody, relied on them to process their own grief. But think about how insane that is for a regular human being. You're in your 20s, dealing with your own burnout, your own insecurities, and an entire fandom is treating your voice like a prescription medication. That pressure doesn't just build character, it fractures you. And you could see the fractures if you actually paid attention, long before the police got involved. Look at Peniel. In a group defined by powerhouse vocals, Peniel was the rapper, the visual, the guy who didn't get the high notes. If you scroll through K-pop forums from that era, the chatter about him is genuinely depressing to read. Fans constantly questioned his necessity. What does Peniel even do? Was a running joke that wasn't really a joke. The industry demands perfection, and when you're in a group where the vocal line is treated like royalty, standing next to them with a different skill set feels like a crime to the most toxic pockets of the fandom. The guy was literally stressing himself bald. He openly talked about his hair loss, his panic attacks, his intense anxiety about his position in the group. He was fading into the background, wearing hats to hide his thinning hair, terrified that one bad stage would give the internet the excuse it needed to kick him out. Peniel didn't have a drug scandal, but he was absolutely drowning in the same toxic sludge of K-pop expectations. He was living proof that the healing group wasn't actually healed. They were just better at hiding the panic. Then Il-hoon blew the whole facade wide open. The details that leaked from the prosecution were damning. It wasn't a one-time mistake at a party. It was calculated, long-term, habitual use. He was routing money through acquaintances, picking up packages disguised as dietary supplements. When the judge handed down a 2-year prison sentence, later reduced on appeal but still leaving a permanent criminal record, it sent a shockwave through the industry. Cube Entertainment, their agency, went dead silent. The standard K-pop PR playbook for a drug scandal is total erasure. You cut the member out, you scrub the group's social media, you pretend they never existed, and you march on with the remaining members. BTOB couldn't do that cleanly. You can't just airbrush a main rapper out of a decade of memories when your whole brand is built on sincerity. So they sat in this agonizing, messy limbo. They didn't defend him. Eunkwang, the leader, basically came out and said they were sorry for disappointing everyone, acknowledging the crime without making excuses. But the fans ripped themselves apart. Social media turned into a war zone. You had one side screaming that Il-hoon was a criminal who tarnished the group's legacy and deserved to be forgotten. Then you had another side clinging to the trauma-bonded slogan BTOB is always 7. Acting like cutting him loose was a betrayal of their emotional journey. It was messy, it was hypocritical, and it exposed the exact flaw in the parasocial relationship K-pop thrives on. Right as this nuclear bomb went off, the universe handed them another crushing blow: the military draft. In South Korea, able-bodied men have to serve, and BTOB's oldest members were right at the cutoff age. So you have a group reeling from the most humiliating scandal of their careers, and simultaneously they are being physically pulled apart by the government. Eunkwang went first, then Changsub, then Minhyuk. For a brief, terrifying window, fans genuinely thought the group group was just going to quietly disband. The industry fully expected them to fade away. When a group loses a member to scandal and the rest to the military at the same time, that is usually the end of the story. Agencies use the military hiatus to bury bad press and pivot to newer, cleaner groups. But BTOB just sort of refused to die. Eunkwang was in the military, literally serving his country, and he was still releasing music, sending voice messages to fans, acting as this emotional anchor from inside a base. Hyunsik, who was left behind to hold the fort, was churning out compositions that felt like grief anthems. The sheer stubbornness of it was fascinating to watch. They weren't fighting back with flashy TikTok dances or viral gimmicks. They fought back by just being sad out loud. By the time 2022 rolled around and they were finally, miraculously, all out of the military and attempting a full group comeback without Il-hoon, the exhaustion was palpable. You can't fake the kind of tiredness they brought to their 2022 album. When they performed the song and Outsider, they didn't look like shiny K-pop idols. They looked like guys who had survived a car crash and were back on stage to tell you about the scars. Their voices had changed. The pristine, clean vocals they were famous for in 2015 had a rasp to them now. There were cracks in the high notes, but honestly, those cracks were the most real thing they'd ever done. They stopped trying to be the perfect, unbothered vocal machines the industry wanted. They leaned all the way into being broken men who were still trying to sing anyway. Outsider was basically an anthem for anyone who felt alienated, and listening to it post-scandal, post-hiatus, it felt less like a pop track and more like a quiet confession. What BTOB went through exposes the absolute ruthlessness of the emotional economy in K-pop. The industry loves to market healing idols because trauma sells. Sad ballads get streams. Vulnerability builds fan loyalty. But the industry never actually wants to deal with the human beings who have to manufacture that vulnerability. When Il-hoon broke the law, it wasn't just a legal issue. It shattered the illusion that BTOB were these pure, comforting protectors. And when Peniel was quietly having panic attacks over his hair and his worth, it showed that the "it's okay" mantra they were selling to fans wasn't powerful enough to cure their own insecurities. They were expected to be therapists for millions, but nobody was therapy for them. The fans who chanted "BTOB is always 7" meant well, but that phrase became a prison. How do you move forward when your fandom refuses to acknowledge reality? They had to figure out how to grieve the loss of their own group dynamic while still performing on stage, smiling for cameras, and acting like the glue wasn't actively melting.